They said Mistress Eleanor Calder never recovered after the fever took her daughter. The servants buried the little girl beneath a magnolia tree, but every night her mother still set a place for her at supper. A white dress, a plate untouched, and a name whispered like a prayer: Isabel. A year later, 2 twin girls from the quarters were brought into the house. Identical faces, identical eyes. The mistress looked at them and smiled for the first time since the funeral. "My Isabel," she said, "you've come back." From that moment, the twins were no longer Ada and Alma. They were Isabel by command, one by day, one by night, until even they forgot which one was real. This is the story of the mirror twins, the children who were forced to live as the ghost of another. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to South Carolina, 1851. The bells tolled just once before the air went still. No wind, no bird song, only the low hum of insects that always seemed to follow death in the Carolina heat. The Calder house stood at the top of the hill, its white columns streaked with age and salt, overlooking the marsh where the fever had come from. Mistress Eleanor Calder stood at the edge of the magnolia grove, watching as the small coffin was lowered into the dark soil. Her daughter, Isabel, was 9 years old when the fever took her. 9, the age when girls still spoke to dolls and dreamed of heaven in pastel colors. The servants moved quietly, their faces unreadable, their motions slow and reverent. Eleanor didn't cry. She hadn't since the child's last breath. The physician had said the fever would pass by morning. By morning, Isabel's hand was cold in hers. The mother had sent for more quinine, more prayers, more everything. But nothing came. The plantation fell silent, as though the house itself held its breath. After the burial, Eleanor ordered the nursery to remain untouched. The windows stayed closed. The child's dress, a small white frock trimmed with lace, remained hanging behind the door. Meals were still served with an extra setting at the end of the table. When the servants cleared it away, Eleanor would whisper that her daughter had eaten enough. At night, she sat in the rocking chair by the nursery window, humming lullabies to the dark. People whispered. They said the fever had burned something out of her, that when Isabel's body cooled, the mistress's mind had gone with it. The preacher came, the neighbors called, but she refused all visitors. Even the minister's wife, who had lost 2 sons herself, was turned away at the gate. By the 3rd week, the smell of lilies had taken over the house. A dozen vases lined the hall, their petals curling and browning, the air thick and sweet. The servants began to fear the sound of her footsteps in the corridor, soft, measured, the rhythm of a woman walking with no destination, no sleep. In the evenings, the sun sank behind the swamp, and the windows turned gold before the darkness swallowed them. Sometimes from the quarters, they saw her standing in the nursery window, a silhouette holding a small white dress against her chest. Once, a stable hand swore he heard her speaking to someone inside, her voice calm, almost tender. He thought she was praying until she paused, as if listening, and answered in a child's voice. By summer's end, the Calder plantation was quiet as a tomb. The cotton went unpicked, the fields grew wild. The mistress remained in her mourning black, a ghost among the living, watching the horizon as if waiting for someone to return. Now they say that was the season when her grief began to take shape, and that by autumn it would have a face again. By the time autumn came, the Calder plantation had become a shrine to silence. The windows stayed shuttered against the coastal wind, the mirrors covered in gauze, and the mistress's voice, once sharp as a bell, had softened into a whisper. Her grief no longer wept. It watched. The servants said she moved through the house like someone waiting to be called back from a dream. Every night she walked from the parlor to the nursery, pausing before the little bed as though expecting its occupant to breathe again. Eleanor began to visit the quarters more often, something she had never done in the days before the fever. She said she was checking on the children. In truth, she was looking for one child, her own, hidden among the faces of others. She studied every girl between 7 and 10, measuring the tilt of their eyes, the curve of their mouths, the texture of their hair. The women bowed their heads when she came, They did not meet her gaze. One humid afternoon, when the air smelled of rain and smoke, Eleanor saw them. Two identical girls standing near the well, same small frame, same braided hair glistening in the light. They were drawing water for the cook, laughing quietly, their reflections wavering in the surface of the bucket. For a moment, the sound seemed to reach across the distance between life and death. The mistress stopped. The bucket slipped from one girl's hand, splashing her dress. When they turned, their faces caught the sun, and something inside Eleanor broke loose. "Whose children are these?" she asked. Her voice was calm, too calm. The overseer stammered that they were sisters, twins born to a woman named Delilah who worked in the laundry. "Twins," Eleanor repeated, as if tasting the word. "And what are their names?" "Ada and Alma, ma'am." She nodded slowly, almost smiling. "Ada and Alma," she said, the syllables soft, testing, then, "No, not anymore." That night she wrote a note in her ledger. 2 girls to be brought to the house for domestic instruction. Her handwriting was steady for the first time in months. She sealed it, left it on the overseer's desk, and returned to the nursery. There, beneath the pale lamplight, she lifted Isabel's dress from the hook and smoothed its creases, whispering the name as though summoning it from the fabric. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The servants in the quarters murmured prayers. Delilah clutched her chest when she heard whose children had been summoned. "She's seen them," someone said, "and once she sees, she takes." By morning, the order was carried out. The twins were told they were to serve in the big house. "Special work," the overseer said. They didn't understand. They only knew their mother wept as they were led up the hill toward the house with the shuttered windows and the magnolia tree that never lost its bloom. The day the twins were brought to the big house, the sky hung low and grey, and the air smelled of iron and rain. They stood together on the porch, their small hands locked tight, dressed in simple linen dresses that clung to their knees. Their mother, Delilah, had begged to walk with them, but the overseer said the mistress wanted them alone. So they climbed the steps, one hesitating with each board that creaked beneath her bare feet. Mistress Eleanor met them in the foyer, where the light from the tall windows fell in narrow gold bands across the floor. Her black gown trailed behind her like spilled ink, her face pale and smooth, her eyes fever-bright. For a long time she said nothing, just stared at them, head tilted, lips parted as though she were trying to remember a word that once held meaning. "Which of you is older?" she asked at last. The girls looked at each other, unsure if it was a trick. "Ada, ma'am," one whispered. Eleanor nodded slightly. "And Alma," she said, turning to the other. "You'll stay close to your sister." Her voice trembled as she said, "sister," as though the word itself carried weight. "You'll both stay close," she murmured. She ordered the housemaid to bring water and soap, and the twins were bathed in the scullery until their skin gleamed beneath the lanterns. Their hair was brushed, tied with ribbons, and the white dress, Isabel's dress, was brought down from the nursery. It was too fine, too bright against their skin. The mistress traced her fingers along the lace collar, then handed it to Ada. "Try this on," she said softly. Ada hesitated, but Eleanor's smile was gentle, pleading. "Please, it was hers. You'll look lovely in it." When Ada stepped out, the mistress gasped, not from beauty, but from recognition. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, that's her." Then she turned to Alma. "You'll wear this one tomorrow," she said, pressing the fabric into her hands. "You must be just like her, both of you." That night, Delilah crept to the edge of the grove and watched the upstairs window flicker with lamplight. She could just make out the 2 small shapes moving inside, the shadow of the mistress hovering between them. The wind carried a sound down the hill, humming, then laughter, then silence again. Delilah crossed herself. "Lord," she whispered, "keep their names." Inside, Eleanor sat in the nursery rocking chair, her hands resting on the twins' shoulders. The girls stared into the mirror before them, dressed alike, their reflections trembling in the candlelight. "Now," the mistress said softly, her voice trembling between joy and madness, "let's begin again." The first morning in the big house began before sunrise. The girls were woken by a knock, soft but sharp, like a reminder that sleep was no longer theirs to choose. The maid, Ruth, led them into a room lined with lace curtains and pale wallpaper, a place that smelled faintly of roses and dust. Mistress Eleanor waited at the writing desk, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. "Good morning, Isabel," she said, and both girls froze. When neither answered, her gaze sharpened. "When I speak, you answer. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Ada murmured. Alma nodded quickly beside her. Eleanor's tone softened. "Good. We mustn't lose our manners." She gestured to two identical ribbons laid neatly on the table, one pale blue, one white. "Which color does Isabel like best?" Ada hesitated. "Blue, ma'am." The mistress smiled, her lips thin. "Yes, she always did." She tied the ribbon into Ada's hair and placed the other in Alma's hand. "You will wear it tomorrow. Isabel must be the same, no matter which of you she is." That was how the lessons began. The days passed in a rhythm of quiet correction. They learned to read aloud, to stand still, to recite psalms in unison. Every gesture was mirrored, every blink, every breath. If one hesitated, the other was punished with silence. Eleanor's rules were never shouted, never cruel in word, but their calmness made them crueler still. By the third day, the girls no longer spoke to each other unless told. They moved as if bound by invisible thread, one stepping forward, the other matching her without thought. In the evenings, the mistress would make them stand side by side before the tall mirror in the nursery, both wearing the white dress, both holding a small porcelain doll that had once belonged to her dead daughter. "Which of you do I love more?" she would ask softly. When the girls stayed silent, she'd laugh, a sound sharp as glass. "You mustn't be jealous of yourselves." At night, Ada whispered to Alma in their shared bed, "Do you think she knows which one is us?" Alma shook her head. "She don't see us," she said. "She only sees her." Down the hall, the mistress sat in the rocking chair, watching the door. The twins' voices faded into the hum of the cicadas outside. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Good night, my darling Isabel." In her mind, two soft breaths answered as one. By the following week, the mistress's lessons had grown more exacting, her tone quieter, her eyes harder to read. Every day began with a single phrase, "Good morning, Isabel." It was no longer a question, but a command. If one twin answered before the other, the mistress would pause, her gaze darting between them, and then simply say, "Try again." They learned quickly that hesitation meant something worse than anger. It meant disappointment. Soon, Eleanor began to separate the girls' hours. "You'll study in the morning," she told Ada, smoothing her hair with a trembling hand, "and you'll sleep." Her eyes shifted to Alma. "You'll study at night. The body must rest, but the soul does not." That was the first time she said it, as if the soul of her lost child had been split in two and she was merely helping it find balance. The servants noticed the change almost at once. The girls passed each other in the hall, one yawning, one just waking, exchanging a brief glance like the reflection of a dream. At meals, only one sat with the mistress. The other ate in the kitchen, silent, under watchful eyes. They began to whisper among themselves that there were really two Isabellas now, the day one and the night one, and that neither truly belonged to herself anymore. The house itself seemed to bend around the mistress's madness. Curtains were drawn in rooms where sunlight once fell. A single candle was kept burning in the nursery window at all hours, its flame trembling in the dark like a heartbeat. Eleanor insisted that one of the twins keep it lit, so she can find her way home. The girl on duty would stand by the sill, eyes half closed, fighting sleep until her reflection blurred in the glass. One evening, Ruth, the maid, tried to speak to the mistress. She said the girls were too tired, too pale, that one of them had fainted near the parlour steps. Eleanor listened politely, her face a mask of calm, then turned back to her embroidery. "Children adapt," she said softly. "They forget pain quicker than we do." Then she added, "Besides, they're not children anymore. They're my Isabel now." That night, Ada woke to find Alma sitting up in bed, whispering her own name again and again as though afraid it might vanish. "Say it with me," Alma begged, clutching her sister's hand. "Say we ain't her." Ada hesitated. In the stillness between them, a voice drifted from the hallway, soft, broken, and terribly kind. "Go back to sleep, my love," the mistress called. "Tomorrow will be better." And for the first time, neither girl knew which of them she was speaking to. The first to forget was Ada. It happened quietly, without struggle or warning, a name left unsaid, a thought that drifted away like dust. At breakfast one morning, when the mistress asked, "Who are you, my dear?" she replied, "Isabel," without hesitation. Her voice was steady, almost relieved. Alma froze beside her, her spoon trembling in her hand. The mistress smiled. "Good girl," she said, and stroked Ada's hair with a tenderness that hurt to look at. From that moment the balance shifted. Ada was the day Isabel, the favored one who read aloud from the Psalms, walked beside the mistress in the gardens, and practiced piano in the parlor. Alma became the night Isabel, the shadow left to pick up what daylight abandoned, the prayers, the chores, the silence. She began to sleep in the narrow bed beside the nursery window, where the candle burned endlessly. The flame flickered across her face as she whispered her name over and over, like a secret she was no longer allowed to keep. Down in the quarters, Delilah waited for news. The servants who worked in the house told her little. They were afraid to speak of what they saw. "The girls don't talk much," Ruth said quietly one evening. "They just move the way she tells them to." Delilah clasped her hands until the knuckles whitened. "My babies ain't dolls," she whispered. "She don't get to wind them up." That night, Delilah crept toward the big house under the cover of fog. The crickets went silent as she neared the magnolia grove, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth. Through the window, she saw the candles glow. Two small figures sat by the mirror, dressed in white. One brushed the other's hair. Behind them, the mistress's reflection loomed like a dark flame. Inside, Eleanor was speaking softly. "When she looks back at you, you must smile. Always smile, my love. If you stop smiling, she'll disappear again." Alma tried to obey. Her lips twitched, trembling, but the smile would not come. The mistress's hand froze mid-stroke, then tightened in her hair. "Don't make me lose her again," she whispered. "Not again." The next morning, Ada noticed a small bald patch on her sister's scalp where the hair had been pulled too hard. She reached out to touch it, but Alma pulled away. "She says we're the same," Ada murmured. "Maybe if we try harder." "No!" Alma's voice cracked, fierce and small. "She's trying to make us gone." Outside, the mist rolled over the fields, soft and endless, swallowing the fence posts and the river beyond. The house creaked with the sound of footsteps pacing upstairs. Ada looked toward the door, where the candlelight trembled. Somewhere down the hall, the mistress began to hum the lullaby again, the one Isabel had loved, the one both girls now knew by heart. And in that moment, even the melody felt like a command. By early winter, the mistress's lessons had changed. They were no longer about reading or prayers, but about imitation. "You must be one," she said each morning, arranging them before the long mirror in the nursery. "Two bodies, one soul. When she smiles, you smile. When she breathes, you breathe." The girls did as they were told, their reflections merging into a single rhythm until they began to forget which movement had come first. Eleanor sat behind them, always watching. She took notes in a small book bound in leather, the kind used for keeping household accounts, marking small observations like a scientist cataloguing an experiment. Ada, steady voice. Alma, hesitant blink, corrected posture, must reward obedience. Sometimes she made them exchange tasks. The one who played the piano in the morning must sew in the evening, and vice versa. Isabel was never predictable, she explained with a faint laugh. She was changeable, like the light. The servants were forbidden from using the twins' real names under threat of dismissal. Even Delilah's name was no longer spoken upstairs. Eleanor said it made the girls confused. To ensure discipline, she dismissed 2 housemaids and replaced them with younger girls who asked fewer questions. The house grew quieter. Even laughter from the kitchen seemed muffled by invisible hands. Alma began to falter under the weight of the mistress's gaze. Her lessons came later and later into the night, when the candles burned low and the air thickened with wax and smoke. The mistress would sit close beside her, whispering as Alma read aloud from a children's primer. "Good," she would say. "Better." Then, when Alma stumbled over a word, her hand would land on the girl's shoulder, light but firm. "Do you want to disappear again?" One evening, Ada found Alma crying in the narrow space between the wardrobe and the wall, her hands pressed to her ears. "She keeps saying I'm fading," Alma whispered. "She says I'm not real." Ada knelt beside her, trying to hush her. But in the mirror across the room, their reflections did not move the same way. Ada looked at it, startled. Alma turned away. Downstairs, Ruth and Jonah whispered in the pantry. "It ain't right," Jonah muttered. "You can feel it when you walk past that door. Cold as a cellar." Ruth crossed herself. "She's trying to bring back the dead," she said, "and she's using them babies to do it." In the days that followed, Eleanor began to single them out more. When Ada smiled, she was rewarded with honeyed praise and soft words. When Alma hesitated, she was met with stillness, a silence that felt worse than scolding. The mistress didn't shout, she didn't strike. She simply looked away, as though Alma had vanished. That night, Alma whispered to her sister through the dark, her voice trembling. "If she stops seeing me," she said, "I think I'll stop being here." Ada didn't answer. She just held her hand until the morning light came, pale and uncertain, through the cracks in the shutters. It was near Christmas when the mistress began to speak of souls. She said it softly, like she was talking to herself, her eyes unfocused, her needle still in hand. "Not every child carries the same light," she murmured one evening as Ada practiced the hymn she'd been taught. "Some shine brighter, some are closer to heaven." The words drifted into the air like incense, invisible but heavy, and the girls felt their weight without understanding why. Soon after, she began saying it more plainly. "You," she'd tell Ada, smiling faintly, "you remind me of her." Then her gaze would slide to Alma, colder, questioning, assessing. "And you must try harder, my love." Isabel never frowned so much. The house began to move according to those quiet distinctions. Ada's plate was served first at meals. Ada's ribbon was tied with care, her shoes polished by Ruth herself. Alma's chores doubled, her lessons shortened. When she faltered, the mistress didn't scold her. She sighed, a sound of disappointment so deep it echoed long after she left the room. Ada felt the change too, though she didn't know how to name it. She wanted to help her sister, but each time she tried, Eleanor's affection turned colder. "Don't distract her," the mistress would say. "She needs to learn to behave like you." And Ada, frightened of losing the fragile kindness she'd been given, began to say less. Her smiles became obedient things, practiced, hollow, safe. At night, Alma whispered into the darkness, "She's trying to make us fight." But her sister lay still, pretending not to hear. There were times Ada even believed the mistress, that maybe Isabel really did live inside her more than in Alma. She didn't want to believe it, but when the mistress touched her cheek and said, "My good girl," something warm stirred in her chest, something like belonging. The servants saw it unfold like a slow sickness. They called it the choosing. Ruth avoided their eyes when she served the girls breakfast. Jonah, who worked the stables, stopped whistling when the mistress passed. In the quarters, Delilah felt the unease long before the news reached her. She woke in the night, heart pounding, certain she had heard one of her daughters crying in her sleep, though she was miles away. Inside the house, the mirror became a battleground. Eleanor would seat them before it and say, "Look closely. Tell me which of you is more her." The twins would stare at their reflections until the candle burned low, until they could no longer tell where one face ended and the other began. Sometimes Eleanor would place her hands on their shoulders and close her eyes, breathing deeply as if trying to feel a heartbeat that wasn't there. "One of you," she'd whisper, "is closer to my Isabel's soul." Neither girl dared to ask which one she meant. but the silence that followed told them everything. By January, the mistress no longer hid her preference. To the rest of the house, Ada was the Isabel now, the child who sat beside Eleanor in the parlour, the one whose laughter echoed faintly down the hall like a memory half recalled. She wore the white dress every Sunday, the blue ribbon that matched her eyes, and a locket that had once belonged to the real child. The mistress fastened it around her neck with trembling fingers, whispering, "There you are." Alma stood behind them, hands clasped, invisible in the reflection of the mirror. When she reached to touch the same dress, Eleanor's voice stopped her. "No," she said, soft but final. "You'll spoil it. Let your sister wear it." The servants saw it, the quiet cruelty wrapped in affection. Ada was praised for obedience, Alma scolded for thought. If Ada stumbled in her lessons, the mistress smiled, called it charm. When Alma hesitated, she sighed. "You mustn't be jealous," Eleanor would murmur, stroking Ada's hair. "You should be proud to serve her. She's the better part of you." In the evenings, the girls were still made to sit together before the mirror, though now the mistress often spoke only to Ada. She corrected her posture, adjusted her chin, smoothed her curls with motherly tenderness. Alma was told to watch, to learn from what perfection looks like. She obeyed, but her eyes no longer saw the mirror. They saw the walls closing in, the way Eleanor's presence filled every inch of the room, the way Ada's reflection began to move a half-second before her own. Delilah's name was never spoken aloud, but it lingered like a ghost between them. One night, when the mistress had gone to bed, Alma whispered to Ada, "You remember Mamma's hands, the scar on her thumb from the wash-tub?" Ada stared at her, brow furrowed. "No," she said, "that wasn't ours." Alma shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "She made you forget," she hissed. "She's stealing you from me." Ada didn't answer. Her eyes were glassy, distant, the same color as the candle flame trembling on the bedside table. Downstairs, Ruth and Jonah spoke in hushed tones. "It's the little one she's breaking," Ruth said, drying her hands. "The one who won't bend." Jonah nodded. "That woman's been talking to shadows since the fever. It's the living that's paying for it now." The next day, Eleanor took Ada into town, her first trip beyond the plantation since Isabel's death. She told everyone it was her niece visiting from Savannah. Ada said nothing, eyes wide at the faces that stared back. For the first time, she was called Miss Calder. When they returned, Alma was waiting by the steps, dirt on her dress, her hair loose and wild. She reached for her sister's hand, but Ada pulled away. "Don't," she whispered. "She'll see." And when Eleanor opened the door behind them, Alma realized she already had. After the trip to town, the house fell into a deeper kind of silence. The mistress seemed almost tender toward Ada now, her voice low and doting, her hand always resting on the girl's shoulder. "My perfect child," she would murmur, as if speaking to herself. But where there was warmth for Ada, there was only stillness for Alma. Eleanor no longer scolded her. She didn't need to. Her punishment was silence, an erasure that worked like frost, slow and suffocating. When Alma spoke, the mistress would act as if she hadn't heard. When she entered a room, Eleanor would turn away. "You mustn't interrupt," she'd say to Ada, though Alma had said nothing at all. Each omission left a bruise that didn't show on skin. Ruth tried once to comfort the girl, offering her a slice of cornbread in the kitchen, but the mistress appeared in the doorway, eyes sharp, smile faint. "She's fasting today," Eleanor said, her tone calm, polite. Ruth froze. Alma lowered her gaze and handed the bread back. That night, Ada woke to find her sister sitting at the window again, knees pulled to her chest. The candlelight danced against her face, casting hollow shadows beneath her eyes. "She don't see me anymore," Alma whispered. "When she looks at me, it's like I ain't here." Ada wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Every day, her sister's presence seemed to fade, her laughter first, then her voice, until even her footsteps made no sound on the floorboards. In the nursery, Eleanor replaced one of the 2 small beds with a cabinet for linens. "There's no need for 2, she said lightly. "The other one can rest elsewhere." She called it an act of tidiness, but it was something darker, a declaration that there was room for only one Isabel now. Days passed with measured monotony. Ada learned to read music. She sat at the piano while the mistress hummed softly behind her, eyes closed, head swaying to the rhythm. Sometimes Eleanor's hand would drift toward Ada's hair, stroking it absent-mindedly as though she were petting memory itself. "You're all I have left," she whispered. In the evenings, when the candle in the nursery burned low, Alma would trace her name in the dust along the baseboard, just 3 letters, A-L-M. By morning, Ruth would find them wiped clean. Delilah heard nothing from her daughters, only rumors that one of them had grown sickly, pale as wax. "She's not sick," Jonah said quietly when he brought supplies down to the quarters. "She's fading. That woman's making her disappear." And in the grand house that overlooked the swamp, the mistress of Calder Hall sat by the piano, listening to a song that belonged to no one, played by a girl who no longer knew her own name. Beyond the walls of the Calder house, the world went on as if untouched by grief. The fields turned gold, the trees shed their leaves, and the air carried the faint sweetness of decay that marked the slow death of autumn. Men in the quarters still rose before dawn, their songs rising faintly over the mist as they went to the fields. The rhythm of life continued, but the big house stood apart from it, still, hushed and strange. Ruth sometimes paused by the window while scrubbing linen, glancing toward the upper floor where the curtains never opened. "It's like the house don't breathe no more," she whispered to Jonah one morning. "Used to be laughter up there. Now it's just them girls," and her Jonah shook his head. "That ain't laughter," he said. "That's the sound madness makes when it starts talking to itself." Inside, Eleanor's rules had multiplied. Every clock in the house was set to a different hour. The twins, or rather the twin and her shadow, lived by her shifting time. Breakfast could come at dawn or midnight. Lessons might stretch until candle wax melted down to puddles on the table. She said she was teaching them discipline, but the truth was, she was teaching them surrender. Ada thrived under her gaze. Her speech softened, her posture mirrored the mistress's. She walked like her, even paused the same way before speaking. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the girl looking back. Pale, polished, perfect. The mistress called it grace. Alma, meanwhile, spent most of her days in the corner room beside the linen cabinet, her tasks small and endless, sewing buttons, dusting the same shelf, cleaning the same silver spoon until her reflection blurred. She had learned to be quiet, to exist without notice. Her voice had become a ghost inside her throat. The nights were worst. The sound of the piano drifted through the hall, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted, depending on which Isabel was playing. Alma would listen from her small bed, tracing invisible circles on her wrist to keep herself anchored. Sometimes she hummed along, softly, so softly that even the air seemed not to hear. Down in the quarters, Delilah dreamt of her daughters every night, sometimes of their laughter, sometimes of one calling her name from far away. She woke with tears and dirt beneath her nails, as though she'd been clawing at the earth in her sleep. "They're in trouble," she whispered to the darkness. "I can feel it in my bones." In town, people had begun to talk about Mistress Calder again. They said she'd been seen walking the veranda at strange hours, speaking to the night air as if to someone unseen. One peddler swore he heard 2 voices reply from the upstairs window, one steady, one faint, both saying the same word, "Mama." By winter's edge, the Calder plantation no longer looked like a home. It looked like a stage, a place where grief performed itself endlessly, and the living were forced to play their parts until they forgot how to stop. The invitation to madness came disguised as celebration. On a cold morning in late January, Eleanor Calder announced that her daughter's birthday would be observed. Properly, as it should have been. Ruth was told to prepare a cake, white with sugared roses. Jonah was ordered to fetch fresh magnolia blossoms from the grove. She loved magnolias, the mistress said, her voice trembling with a strange, giddy light. They'll make her feel welcome. The servants exchanged glances but obeyed. None dared to remind her that Isabel had been dead for nearly a year. The mistress moved through the house with the brisk purpose of a woman reborn. She polished the silver herself, arranged the dining room, laid out 2 identical dresses on the bed upstairs, small, lace-trimmed, carefully pressed. When Ruth saw them, her breath caught. 2? She asked quietly. Eleanor smiled. 1 for the morning, 1 for the evening. My darling must look perfect from every angle. That afternoon, the air grew heavy with the scent of sugar and flowers. The table was set with fine china, candles tall as forearms, and a single chair at the head that no one dared to touch. Ada and Alma were led down, dressed in white, their hair braided alike. The mistress met them halfway, her face soft with joy and exhaustion. "Do you remember what day it is?" she asked. Ada nodded. "It's Isabel's birthday." Eleanor's smile widened. "No, my love. It's your birthday." "Ours." She seated them side by side, hands folded in their laps. "You'll sing for her," she said, the hymn she liked best. Her tone was gentle, coaxing, almost kind, but her eyes shimmered with something brittle, a light that burned too bright. The twins began to sing, their voices thin, uncertain. The song wavered like a fragile flame, catching on certain words. Grace, mercy, heaven. Eleanor clasped her hands and swayed as though in prayer. Then, halfway through the second verse, Alma faltered, her throat tightened, her voice broke, the room went still. Eleanor opened her eyes. "Again," she said. Alma tried, the note barely a whisper. The mistress's smile stiffened, then vanished. She rose, walked behind them, and laid a trembling hand on Ada's shoulder. "You keep singing," she whispered. "Don't stop. She needs to hear it." Ada obeyed, her voice rising alone, thin and high as glass. Alma bit her lip until she tasted blood. When the song ended, Eleanor clapped once, softly. "Beautiful," she said, though her tone was hollow. Then she turned to Alma. "Why didn't you sing for her?" Alma's lips parted, but no sound came. The mistress bent low, her breath warm against the child's ear. "Don't tell me you've forgotten her name." That night, after the candles had burned low and the servants had gone, Eleanor sat at the table staring at the half-eaten cake. Her hand trembled as she touched the icing, tracing the single word written there in pale pink sugar. Isabel. Upstairs, Ada cried herself to sleep. Alma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, whispering the same name until dawn, not for the dead child, but for herself. The morning after the mistress's birthday, the air inside the house felt heavier, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The cake had been cleared away, the flowers wilted overnight, and the girls were back to their lessons. Ada reading softly from a prayer book, while Alma stood behind her, eyes fixed on the floor. The mistress sat nearby, half asleep in her chair, humming a tune that never seemed to end. That was when Jonah came. He was there to repair a shutter that had blown loose during the storm, but when he passed the open door of the nursery, he paused. The sight inside stopped him cold. 2 little girls dressed alike, standing so still they looked carved from wax, while their mistress whispered corrections between breaths. For a long moment, Jonah said nothing. Then, catching Alma's eyes, wide, tired, pleading, he smiled faintly and winked. A kindness so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But not by her. For Alma, it was the first moment of recognition she'd felt in weeks. Later that day, when Eleanor left for her afternoon rest, Jonah slipped into the kitchen and whispered to Ruth, "Bring the little one a piece of bread." She looked starved. Ruth hesitated, but she did as he asked. When she handed it to Alma in the hall, the girl took it with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered, and for a heartbeat the world seemed human again. But kindness has a way of echoing through quiet houses. That evening, Eleanor found the crumbs on the nursery floor. She said nothing at first. Her silence stretched thin as wire until Ada fidgeted in her chair and Alma froze where she stood. Then Eleanor spoke, calm, deliberate. "Which of you ate without permission?" Neither answered. The mistress's hand lifted slowly, pointing toward Alma. "You," she said softly. "Always you." She called Jonah from the yard. "You were in my house today," she said, her tone polite. "Did you forget your place?" Jonah kept his head bowed. "No, ma'am." She smiled faintly. "Then you won't forget this lesson either." The next morning, Jonah was gone from the grounds. Some said he was sold to a neighbor's farm. Others whispered he had simply left in the night. Ruth never believed either story. She said his hammer was still by the window where he'd been working. After that, no one spoke to the twins unless spoken to first. The kitchen grew quiet, the laughter gone. And when Alma passed through the hall, she could feel eyes turn away. It was as if the entire house had learned the mistress's trick to make someone vanish by pretending they were never there at all. That night, Alma pressed her forehead against the cold window pane and whispered Jonah's name. Outside, the wind stirred the magnolias, but no sound answered back. The storm came without warning. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and the trees along the marsh bent like frightened things. Wind pressed against the windows, rattling the shutters, but inside the Calder house, the mistress moved calmly, lighting candles one by one. "A little thunder won't hurt us," she said, her voice steady as glass. "It's only heaven speaking." The girls sat together on the rug, their reflections flickering in the tall mirror that faced the nursery door. The flame from the single candle between them shivered each time the wind moaned. Ada traced patterns in the dust. Alma watched the mirror, tense, waiting for something she couldn't name. Eleanor's footsteps echoed softly as she entered, her dark dress trailing behind her like smoke. "Look at you," she said, her tone both fond and fevered. "My beautiful Isabel." She touched Ada's chin, then turned to Alma. "And you mustn't hide from me anymore." A flash of lightning split the sky, the brightness spilling through the shutters and slicing across their faces. For an instant, Eleanor's eyes gleamed wild and tearful. "She's here," she whispered. "Can't you feel her?" The thunder answered like a drum. Alma flinched. Ada tried to stay still, but her hands trembled. Eleanor took the candle and set it before the mirror. "Sit," she ordered softly. "Both of you." The twins obeyed. Their reflections glowed in the trembling light. Two pale faces, one flame between them. "Now," the mistress whispered, "watch closely. She's waiting in the glass. She's been waiting for me." The girls stared, unsure what to see. Behind them, the house groaned as if it too held its breath. The candle wavered, its flame stretching thin, then doubling, one flame becoming two. Eleanor gasped. "There," she breathed. "There you are, my darling." Her hand reached toward the glass. "Do you see her?" Ada nodded quickly, afraid not to. Alma shook her head, whispering, "There's nothing." The mistress's expression darkened, her smile stiffening into something sharp. "Don't lie," she said. "You'll scare her away." She gripped Alma's shoulders, turning her toward the mirror. "Look again. Look until you see her." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "Please, ma'am," she whispered. "There's no one there." Lightning struck close, shaking the walls. Eleanor's reflection seemed to leap from the mirror, hair wild, face pale and distorted by candlelight. For one terrifying instant, the mistress looked at herself and did not seem to know who she was. Then her voice broke into a sob. "Don't leave me again," she whispered to the reflection. "Don't take them from me too." The candle guttered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room. When Ruth came running at the sound of the thunderclap, she found the mistress kneeling before the mirror, arms outstretched, and the two girls huddled together in the corner, one sobbing, the other silent as stone. Outside, the storm rolled on, and the magnolia tree shuddered under the rain, its roots deep, its blossoms still white as bone. After the storm, the mistress's mind seemed to settle into a fragile calm, the kind that follows a fever, too still to be trusted. For a few days, she barely spoke. She drifted through the house, her gown whispering across the floorboards, her eyes unfocused as if searching for something she'd misplaced in a dream. The servants thought she'd broken at last. They were wrong. What came next was worse. Not madness wild and loud, but madness methodical. Ada began to dream of things she had never seen, a pink parasol, a blue ribbon fluttering beside a riverbank, a small white dress that smelled of violets. When she woke, she could still smell the perfume, faint as breath. The memories were so vivid, she began to believe they were hers. "I remember," she told the mistress one morning. "I remember her song." Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes gleaming like wet glass. "You are her song," she whispered, and pressed her hand against the girl's cheek. Alma watched from the corner of the room, her hands shaking. She wanted to speak, to shout, to remind her sister who she was. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. They caught in her throat like thorns. Each time Ada looked at her now, there was distance in her eyes, a softness that belonged to someone else. At night, Alma began to whisper to herself. She'd sit by the darkened mirror and repeat her name over and over. Alma, Alma, Alma. Sometimes she said Ada's too, just to remember how they sounded together. On the third night, she woke to find Ada standing at the mirror, staring into her reflection. "She talks to me," Ada said quietly, "in my dreams. She says I have to stay." Alma reached for her hand, but Ada didn't move. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. The next morning, Eleanor declared that Ada's lessons would continue alone for a time. "She's delicate," she told Ruth. "The other child distracts her." It isn't fair to either of them. Alma was moved to a smaller room near the attic stairs, cold, narrow, forgotten. She was told it was temporary, but days turned into weeks, and no one came for her. In her isolation, Alma began to see things that weren't there, or perhaps things that were. Shadows that moved when she didn't, whispers that came from behind the walls. Once, she heard a voice humming in the dark, and for a moment she thought it was her sister, until she realized it was her own. Downstairs, Ada's laughter echoed faintly, mingling with the piano's soft melody. It was a sound bright enough to hurt. Alma pressed her palms over her ears, whispering again, her words trembling with the effort of remembering. "I am not her," she said to the empty room. "I am not her." But even as she spoke it, the name that left her lips wasn't her own. Rumors began to coil through the quarters like smoke. The field hands spoke softly when they passed the big house, careful not to meet the mistress's eyes. Someone said she'd locked one of the twins upstairs for days, that food was left outside the door but never touched. Someone else swore they'd heard singing late into the night, 2 voices at first, then 1, then none at all. Whatever truth hid inside those whispers reached Delilah before the week was done. She stopped sleeping. Each night she sat outside her cabin, rocking gently, staring at the hill where the white columns of the house glowed faintly against the moon. Every so often she thought she saw the flicker of a candle in the topmost window, the nursery window, and she'd whisper her daughters' names to the dark. Ada, Alma, come back to me. By the second week, she'd made her decision. A mother don't need permission to see her children, she said. Ruth tried to stop her, gripping her arm hard. "You'll get yourself whipped," she hissed. Delilah looked at her, eyes hollow but burning. "I already been whipped by the Lord. Ain't nothing that woman can do that'll hurt worse than not knowing if my girls still breathe." That night, she crept through the trees behind the stables, the mud sucking at her feet. The air was heavy, full of the hum of crickets and the faint sigh of the river. She knew every creak of the porch steps, every loose board of the back door. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and candle smoke. The only sound was the ticking of a clock that was always wrong. Upstairs, the hallway stretched long and dark. The candlelight flickered beneath one door, the nursery. She pushed it open slowly. Inside, Ada sat at the vanity, hair brushed and perfect, her face expressionless. Alma stood beside her in a thin nightgown, her eyes red, her hands trembling. The mistress sat behind them, combing Ada's hair, humming that same soft lullaby. Delilah's breath caught. "My babies," she whispered. Eleanor turned, calm as if she had been expecting her. "You mustn't interrupt," she said. "You'll confuse them." Delilah stepped forward. "They ain't her, Miss Calder. They're my girls. You done forgot who's dead and who's alive." For a heartbeat, the mistress didn't move. Then she stood, eyes blazing. "I haven't forgotten anything. You should thank me. I've saved them from their misery. They're perfect now." Whole Alma ran to her mother, clutching her skirt. Delilah wrapped her arms around her and whispered, "We're leaving." But Ada stayed seated, frozen. Her lips trembled, caught between fear and longing. Eleanor's voice cracked through the room, quiet but sharp as lightning. "Take one step, and you'll never see her again." The thunder outside rolled like a warning. Delilah held Alma tighter. "Then I reckon that's still better than watching her die slow." The mistress took a step forward. "You can't save what's already mine." The candle flickered. Somewhere in the house, a door slammed as if the building itself recoiled, and for the first time since the fever, Mistress Eleanor Calder looked like a woman who could truly kill. Delilah's words hung in the air like the echo of thunder. For a moment, no one moved. The candle between them sputtered, the small flame bending in the draught that slipped through the nursery's cracked window. Ada's reflection in the mirror trembled. Two faces, one afraid, one uncertain, and in that trembling light, the mistress's eyes seemed to split with it. "You think they belong to you," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with quiet rage. "But I'm the one who saved them. You let them be born in filth. I gave them grace. I gave them a home." Delilah straightened her back, the fear in her chest replaced by something older and stronger, the kind of fury that had kept her alive through a lifetime of taking orders from women who spoke just like this. "You gave them a cage," she said, "and you call it grace because it's got windows." Eleanor moved then, sudden as the lash of a whip, her hand striking Delilah's face so hard the sound cracked through the quiet room. Alma cried out, clutching her mother's skirt. Ada stood frozen, her eyes wide, as though part of her still didn't understand which world was real, the one that called her Isabel, or the one where her mother bled. The mistress's breath came in gasps. "Get out of my house," she hissed. "You've ruined her again. You've made her remember." Delilah wiped the blood from her mouth and looked at her daughters, one trembling in her arms, the other standing pale as paper. "Ada," she said softly, "you remember your sister's name? Say it. Say her name." Ada's lips parted, but no sound came. Eleanor's voice cut through the air, sharp and panicked. "Don't listen to her! You're my Isabel. You're mine." For a moment the room seemed to tilt, the mirror reflecting them all at once, the mistress, the mother, the two girls caught between them. The candle's flame jumped, casting their faces in fractured gold. Delilah turned toward Alma. "Go, baby," down the back stairs. "Now." Alma hesitated, tears streaking her face, but her mother's voice left no room for argument. She slipped toward the door, barefoot, silent as wind. Eleanor lunged forward to stop her, but Delilah grabbed her wrist. The two women struggled, their shadows thrashing across the wall. The candle toppled, spilling wax and fire across the tablecloth. "Stop!" Ada screamed, but her voice was lost beneath the growing roar, the hiss of flames licking up the fabric, the sound of a chair crashing over. Eleanor shoved Delilah back, her breath ragged, her hair falling loose around her face. "You'll burn for this," she gasped. Delilah's reply was barely a whisper. "So will you." In the chaos, Alma darted down the stairs, her small feet pounding against the wood. Ada looked once more at the woman who had called her daughter, at the mother who had risked everything to save her. Then the room filled with smoke, and choice itself disappeared in the firelight. The fire started small, a trembling orange tongue crawling across lace, devouring the hem of the tablecloth before anyone noticed. But grief burns faster than fabric. Within moments, the flame found its way to the curtains, then the drapes, and the room filled with the smell of smoke and roses. The wind from the open window fed it, whipping it alive. Shadows began to dance against the walls like ghosts shaking off their sleep. Eleanor staggered backward, clutching the edge of the vanity, eyes wide but strangely calm. "No one leaves," she whispered, though the words were lost beneath the rising crackle. Ada reached for her, terrified, but the mistress's gaze had turned inward, fixed on something unseen, something only she could hear. "She says one must go," Eleanor murmured. One must return so the other can live. That's how it was meant to be. Delilah coughed through the smoke, her voice hoarse. There ain't no voice but your own, you wicked woman. She grabbed Ada's arm, trying to pull her toward the door, but Eleanor caught the child's other wrist. The two women stood locked in a tug-of-war of love and madness, the child caught between them, her cries drowned by the roar of fire. Let her go, Delilah shouted. She can't leave, Eleanor rasped. She hasn't chosen yet. Ada's scream split the air, high and raw. Alma reappeared in the doorway then, her nightdress torn, soot smearing her small face. "Mama!" she cried, rushing forward. The sight of her sister froze Ada mid-sob, as if she were seeing her reflection step out of the mirror. For a single, dizzying moment, neither girl knew who was who. Eleanor turned to the door, her face lit gold by the fire. "There you are," she whispered, almost smiling. "My two halves, my light and my shadow." The ceiling groaned above them. Sparks rained down like falling stars. "You'll tear her soul apart," Delilah cried. "Ain't you done enough?" The mistress didn't seem to hear. Her hand reached toward the twins, trembling with devotion and delusion. "One must stay," she murmured. "One must go back to heaven or she'll never be whole." Delilah lunged forward, shoving the mistress away with every ounce of strength she had left. Eleanor stumbled, struck her temple against the corner of the vanity, and fell hard to the floor. The crack of her fall was followed by a sound that wasn't a cry, but a gasp, a breath leaving the body too soon. The fire roared higher, swallowing the edges of the room. Ada and Alma clung to each other, coughing, crying, their mother's voice shouting above the noise. "Run!" she screamed. "Run, babies, run!" The twins obeyed, stumbling down the stairs hand in hand as smoke rolled behind them like a living thing. Outside, the night air hit them cold and sharp. Behind them, the Calder house burned, a skeleton of light and heat against the dark Carolina sky. And somewhere in the roar of the flames, they swore they heard their mistress's voice, singing, softly, sweetly, calling a name that no longer belonged to anyone at all. By dawn, the fire had devoured nearly everything. The grand white columns of the Calder house stood blackened against a pale, ash-filled sky, the air thick with smoke and the sweet, sick smell of things that should never burn, linen, oak, flesh. The servants gathered at the edge of the fields, silent, their faces grey with soot and disbelief. No one dared approach until the flames had sunk to embers, until the crackling quieted into an awful stillness. Ruth was the first to step forward. She found Delilah on the ground near the porch, her arms curled protectively around Alma, both covered in soot and blood but breathing. She called for help, her voice breaking. "She's alive! Lord, she's alive!" But as they lifted her, Delilah's eyes fluttered open only for a moment. She looked toward the burning ruins, her voice thin as air. "Other one," she whispered. "My other baby." And then she went still. Alma clung to her, sobbing. But Ada was nowhere to be found. They searched through the smoke and cinders for hours. The roof had collapsed inward, the nursery crushed beneath beams and ashes. When the men pulled back the debris, they found what looked like the mistress's remains, or what little the fire had spared of her. Her hands were clasped around a charred locket, the one she'd given Ada. Inside, beneath the melted glass, the photograph of the real Isabel had fused to the metal. No one spoke of what that meant. By afternoon, only the magnolia tree still stood untouched, its white blossoms ghostly against the ruin. Alma sat beneath it, her dress torn, her hair stiff with ash. She stared at the horizon, eyes empty. Ruth knelt beside her. "Where's your sister, baby?" she asked softly. Alma didn't answer. Her gaze drifted toward the river, where the morning mist was lifting in slow, pale ribbons. That night, they found a small footprint by the water's edge, one print, not two, leading toward the reeds and disappearing there. No one knew if the river had taken her, or if she had walked until the world itself swallowed her name. In the weeks that followed, the plantation's ruins cooled and hardened into silence. The overseer left, the workers moved on. Only Ruth stayed long enough to see the first wildflowers bloom where the house had stood. Sometimes she'd see Alma by the riverbank, humming to herself, twisting bits of grass between her fingers. When Ruth asked who she was talking to, Alma would smile faintly and say, "My sister. She's just under the water, waiting to come back when the sun sets." And every night at dusk, when the river turned red with light, Ruth swore she heard two voices, one above the water, one beneath it, humming the same lullaby the mistress had once sung to her dead child. Time passed, though in the low country, time never really moved. It just thickened, like heat. The ruins of Calder House sank slowly into the earth. The walls, blackened by fire, became home to vines that crept through cracks and windows. By the second spring, the magnolia tree had grown wilder, its roots curling into the old foundation like fingers reclaiming what had once been taken. They said the land was cursed. Some called it haunted. Travellers on the road that ran past the estate told stories of a thin figure near the riverbank at dusk, a girl, barefoot, with pale skin and tangled hair, singing a tune too soft to follow. Those who heard her said it was a lullaby, though none could remember the words after. Alma lived in a small cabin near the water, built from scraps of wood the servants had saved after the fire. Ruth visited her often, bringing bread or mended clothes, though the girl hardly spoke anymore. She had grown quiet, her voice slow and distant, as if she were always listening for something just out of reach. "You shouldn't stay here alone," Ruth would tell her. "It ain't right, child." But Alma would only smile faintly. "I'm not alone," she'd whisper. "She's just asleep." Sometimes Ruth would wake in the middle of the night to see a dim light moving by the river, a single candle, trembling in the dark. Once she followed it halfway through the grove before she heard the singing. Two voices, one faint, one clear, winding together in a tune that froze her blood. The sound stopped the instant she stepped closer. When she reached the riverbank, only the candle floated there, half sunk in the mud. In town, they began to call her the Mirror Girl. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the water after sunset, lest they see themselves where they don't belong. Some swore that if you looked into the river at dusk, you'd see two reflections instead of one. Others said the second face smiled when the first did not. One Sunday, a traveling preacher stopped by Ruth's cabin. He'd heard the stories and wanted to see for himself. She led him to the river at twilight. Alma was there, kneeling by the edge, humming softly as she braided a small crown of wildflowers. "Evening, child," the preacher said gently. She turned to him, eyes bright but far away. "You came too late," she said. "She only wakes when the light is gone." The preacher's hand trembled on his Bible. "Who wakes, child?" Alma smiled. "My sister." And before Ruth could move, the girl stood and stepped into the water, calm and sure, her reflection rippling outward until it vanished into silver. The river swallowed her quietly, as if it had simply taken back what had always belonged to it. In the years that followed, the Calder place became less a memory and more a warning. The plantation was swallowed by vines, its name spoken only in whispers. Travellers avoided the road at night, saying the air around the ruins carried a weight, as though the world itself still remembered the fire. Children in nearby towns told each other stories of the Mirror Twins. They said that on certain nights, when the moon hung low and pale, you could see two little girls by the riverbank, standing hand in hand. One cast a reflection, the other didn't. No one knew what became of Alma. Some said she drowned that night, her soul wandering in search of the sister she lost. Others swore she survived and grew into a woman who never spoke above a whisper, a woman who carried the shadow of her dead twin wherever she went. The truth was simpler and crueler. No one ever really knew which twin had lived. A generation later, the story twisted itself into folklore. Preachers in the countryside told it from their pulpits as a warning about pride, grief, and the sin of trying to steal from God what he had already taken. "Let the dead rest," they'd say, "or they'll drag you down with them." But those who had known the Calder estate, Ruth, the field hands, and the few who had worked in that quiet, haunted house, never spoke of it as sin. They spoke of it as sorrow. Sometimes, when storms swept through the valley and lightning cracked over the magnolia grove, people claimed to hear music drifting through the rain, a lullaby, faint but clear, weaving through the thunder. And if you followed it, if you were foolish enough to walk toward it, you might find the remains of a piano under the fallen beams, its keys yellowed, one note still ringing when the wind passed just right. Old Ruth, before she died, told her granddaughter that the river still kept its secret. "That's where their faces are," she said. "The water remembers what the fire took." And long after she was gone, children still dared each other to go to the river at dusk and look down into the current. Some came back pale and shaking. Some swore they saw nothing. But every few years, one child would return different, quiet, distracted, staring into mirrors as though expecting someone else to look back. The story of the mirror twins lingered, not as history, not as legend, but as a whisper between worlds. Because somewhere in the reflection of that black, slow-moving river, two small girls still waited for their mother's voice. And when the wind was right, it almost sounded like she was answering. Nearly 30 years passed before anyone dared to clear what remained of the Calder estate. The land had changed hands twice, but no one stayed long. The crops refused to grow. The air stayed damp with the scent of river water and ash. It was a quiet curse, the kind that doesn't kill, just reminds you that some places don't forget. Then came a man named Thomas Avery, a surveyor sent from Charleston to measure the old boundaries for sale. He wasn't a superstitious man. He'd laughed when the locals warned him about the twins by the river. But the first night he camped near the ruins, he stopped laughing. He wrote in his journal that the land felt like it was listening. The wind hissed through the magnolia leaves, and when it did, he thought he heard humming, faint, slow, childlike. In the morning, he found small footprints near his tent, side by side, leading down to the water's edge. He told himself they were animal prints distorted by the mud, yet the shape lingered in his mind, too narrow, too deliberate. As he explored what was left of the house, he discovered the remains of the nursery mirror, its frame warped but the glass still clinging to one side. He wiped away the soot and for an instant swore he saw a second reflection behind his own, smaller, blurred, standing perfectly still. When he turned, there was nothing but the echo of his heartbeat in the empty room. That night, Thomas returned to his camp early, uneasy. He kept his fire high, his journal open, and his pistol near at hand. Near midnight, a low voice drifted through the dark, a woman's voice, cracked and weary, singing a lullaby. The tune was soft, broken by pauses, as if she were trying to remember the words. Then beneath it, another sound rose, two children humming in harmony, the second voice always a breath behind the first. He fled the next morning, leaving his tools behind. The locals found his camp a week later. His journal lay open to the last page. The writing was shaky, the ink smeared as though by trembling hands. I saw them, two girls, hand in hand, standing in the water. One smiled, the other didn't. I think the river still remembers their names. After that, no one came near the Calder land again. The magnolia tree still bloomed every spring, its petals white as bone. And on certain nights, when the moon burned low and pale over the water, a faint reflection could still be seen. Two small figures, holding each other, singing to the dark. No one dared to listen long enough to hear how the song ended. By the turn of the new century, the Calder land existed only as a shadow on maps and a whisper in local stories. The fields had been swallowed by forest, the house nothing but a mound of bricks beneath the wild magnolia tree that bloomed stubbornly every spring. Still, people talked about it, not as a real place, but as something half-imagined, a dream that remembered being true. Teachers in nearby towns told their students that the tragedy of the Calder family was a lesson in grief. A mother's love can heal, they said, but when twisted by loss, it can destroy. Yet the people who had lived through that time, or who claimed their grandparents had, never spoke so neatly of it. They said the house itself had learned sorrow, that even when the mistress's bones were gone, her longing still walked the rooms. The legend of the mirror twins drifted through the generations, reshaping itself with each telling. Some said the girls were ghosts, still playing by the riverbank, bound by a promise they never made. Others said one had survived and lived to old age under a different name, never telling her story but humming the same song in her sleep. A few whispered that both twins had lived, but one had forgotten who she was, and that forgetting was its own kind of death. By 1903, the story had spread beyond the county. Folklorists from Charleston and Savannah came asking questions, scribbling notes about the twins who shared one name. One described it as a haunting of identity, a tale where no spirit rises, yet everyone remains possessed. Another wrote that the story wasn't about ghosts at all. It was about grief that refused to die. Those who visited the site said that even in daylight, the air felt wrong. Birds went quiet near the river. The water moved slower, as if something beneath it was listening. On cloudy evenings, the reflection of the magnolia tree stretched across the current, and for a moment, if you looked too long, the branches seemed to form two figures, hands almost touching, faces turned toward the shore. Decades later, when the new road was built through the area, workers unearthed shards of porcelain, a child's teacup, a fragment of a doll's face, a silver locket fused shut by fire. The overseer tossed them aside, but one of the men, curious, tried to pry the locket open. It snapped in half. Inside was nothing, no picture, no name, just a hollow imprint where something once had been. The men laughed, brushed off the dust, and kept digging. By evening, one of them swore he heard humming near the water, soft, faint, and doubled. No one believed him. But when the sun went down, not a single worker stayed past dusk. Years later, when the world had moved on and the story of the Calder twins was little more than a fireside whisper, a woman named Miriam Caldwell came to the river. She said she was a teacher, researching southern folklore. The locals warned her that the river didn't like to be studied, but she smiled politely, said she didn't believe in ghosts and came anyway. She arrived in early spring, when the magnolia tree was blooming, the air thick with sweetness, the petals falling like pieces of snow. She walked the grounds where the house had once stood, now buried beneath moss and silence. Only the outline of the old steps remained, leading nowhere. She set up her writing desk near the river and began to read through the old accounts, the fire, the mistress, the girls. The name Calder appeared over and over, though no one ever agreed on which child had survived. By the third evening, Miriam began to feel uneasy. The air grew heavy just before dusk, the light turning amber and strange. Each night she thought she heard humming near the magnolia tree, two voices, faint and lilting, weaving through the wind. She told herself it was the water, the insects, the tricks of an overactive mind. But one night, as the sun dipped low, she walked to the river's edge and saw something she could never quite explain. In the reflection of the water stood two girls holding hands. Their faces were pale, their dresses rippled with the current, their eyes calm, not sad, not angry, just watching. Miriam blinked, and they were gone. The surface of the river stilled, but she noticed her own reflection shimmer for a moment longer, as though it were deciding whether to return her gaze. She left her notes unfinished. Before she went, she placed a single candle by the magnolia's roots and lit it. The flame bent in the wind, but didn't go out. "For your peace," she whispered, "whichever of you remains." Then she turned back toward the road, never once looking behind her. The candle burned until dawn, and when the first morning light touched the river, it seemed to ripple, slow, deliberate, as if exhaling. For years after, travelers said the land felt softer somehow. The magnolia still bloomed, but the air no longer carried that thick sadness. The river ran clear. No one heard singing anymore, though sometimes, if the evening was quiet and the water perfectly still, one could almost see two faint shapes beneath the surface, two small hands, finally letting go. They called it mercy. And so the story of the mirror twins ended not with vengeance or terror, but with release, the kind of ending that belongs only to the forgotten, whose lives are remembered not by screams, but by silence. The years blurred, and the world forgot the name Calder. The fields were cut into parcels, the river given a new name on new maps. People built roads over the old paths, and children played where the house once stood, never knowing what the ground remembered. But sometimes, when evening fell and the air grew still, an unease would settle across the land. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes when something buried stirs beneath your feet. An old woman who had once been Ruth's granddaughter lived nearby, tending a small chapel at the edge of the woods. Travelers often stopped to rest there. She would give them water and bread, and if they asked about the ruins by the river, she'd hesitate before speaking. Some stories, she'd say, ain't meant to scare, they're meant to remind. Then she'd tell them the tale of a mistress who loved too much and two little girls who forgot who they were, until love itself burned the truth out of them. She never said their names, only the twins, as if naming them might wake something still sleeping in the dark water. When the travellers left, she'd walk down to the riverbank and light a single candle, setting it adrift on the slow current. Sometimes it went out quickly. Sometimes it floated a long while, the flame trembling against the wind. One night, as she knelt by the shore, she caught sight of her reflection, not one face but two, side by side, both smiling faintly. The candle drifted between them, its light doubling in the water. For a moment, she thought she heard the echo of a lullaby, the one her grandmother had hummed long ago, the one about mercy and memory. Then the reflection rippled and was gone. She never told anyone what she saw that night. But the next morning, townsfolk found two candles burning at the edge of the river instead of one. Neither had melted, neither had smoke. And so the legend endured, not as terror, not even as warning, but as a kind of forgiveness. The story of the Mistress and the Mirror Twins became part of the Carolina soil, woven into every breeze that passed through the magnolia trees. Because some griefs do not vanish, they change shape. They become whispers, songs, or reflections that linger when the world turns away. And every so often, when the moon is low and the river glows white as bone, two small voices still hum beneath the surface, not haunting, not pleading, only remembering. If you listened this far, thank you for keeping them company. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Every night we open the doors to the past, to the stories that were meant to stay buried, the griefs that refused to die, and the people who were forgotten until now. Until next time, keep your mirrors covered after dark. And if you ever hear humming by the river, don't look too long.